if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Samueli, and it is, yes, back to a cold, wet, miserable situation in Budapest. Definitely not spring weather. It's just raining, raining, and raining. It's no fun at all. Anyway, thank you very much, everybody who has joined me. I really appreciate you because it is now time for the Thursday night live stream. And again, I always love this opening question. What's the difference between Budapest and Bucharest? A very, very good question. Well, one happens to be the capital of Hungary, and the other one, the capital of the neighboring state of Romania. But maybe there are other differences that spring to mind. Anyway, there's a few subjects I want to get to. So on Saturday, there will be the annual May Day parade, or the Victory, rather, not May Day parade, the Victory Day parade in Russia, which is May the 9th, the commemoration of the victory over Nazism. And of course, you'll recall that, and we've already covered this here on the Gaggle, that Russia has announced that this year's celebrations will be much curtailed. There'll be no display of heavy military hardware. So there'll be no tanks, armored personnel carriers, missiles, all of the usual things that you saw on these previous May the 9th parades. Now, the question then arose right away was, well, what's behind this? Was it that all the heavy military equipment is in use in Ukraine, and that there's none left to spare for just an empty show of hardware capability? Or was this fear of a attack by Ukraine? So Russia had announced, President Putin announced that there would be a ceasefire for May the 8th and May the 9th. Now, Zelensky didn't seem to respond very much to that, but he did suggest a ceasefire from May the 6th and May the 7th, which didn't really make a great deal of sense. So basically, as far as things go at the moment, the Ukraine does not recognize that there will be a ceasefire on May the 9th. This is the coming Saturday, and therefore it's quite possible that there will be some kind of a Ukrainian attack on the parade on Red Square. Now, of course, the events have been drastically curtailed. There won't be too many foreign dignitaries present, but nonetheless, it is possible that there will be a targeted attack on the on that parade. Now, Russia has issued a very stark warning that if there is to be an attack on this parade, then Russia will retaliate very harshly against Kiev. It will hit all kinds of buildings, housing a central command, and has issued an evacuation warning saying, well, everybody needs to evacuate Kiev, including foreign embassies, in anticipation of a possible Russian attack. Now, obviously, there are a number of issues involved. First off, I actually don't see any particular reason for there to be a ceasefire. I mean, Russia ruled out, I think correctly, the Ukraine NATO plan to have essentially a ceasefire, an unconditional ceasefire. I think Russia, again, rightly declared that the whole purpose of the ceasefire would be for NATO to um, replenish Ukrainian forces and rearm Ukraine in preparation for another war down the road. Now, since Russia is, as part of its war aims, is seeking a more permanent settlement with NATO, some kind of a permanent agreement for security architecture for Europe, in which both Russia and the West enjoy mutual security guarantees. A ceasefire doesn't solve Russia's problems, and so Russia said no to the ceasefire. Well, once you say no to a ceasefire, you can't then go around demanding piecemeal ceasefires. And while it's understandable that there might be a case for a ceasefire on religious holidays, which, like Orthodox Easter, obviously Christmas, that it's a kind of a humanitarian gesture, and that's acceptable. There's no particular reason why there should be a ceasefire on Victory Day. I mean, Victory Day is a celebration of Russian military prowess, and Russia can't really expect that Ukraine will not use that as an opportunity to hit Russia's military hardware. And there's the hardware; it's on display, even though this year it isn't. But nonetheless, there'll be Russian armed forces parading around, and so there obviously would be a legitimate military target. There's no reason whatever why Ukraine should agree to a ceasefire. So that's, I think, the first point. The next point is more tricky, which is that if Russia had the capability to attack Ukrainian military headquarters, to inflict very serious, devastating strikes on Ukrainian high command, Ukrainian command and control in Kiev, then you have to wonder, why is it taking 4 years for Russia to start threatening to do this? Why hasn't Russia done this already? So why was Russia only doing something like that, which seems to have a military purpose to it? I mean, hitting command centers, hitting command and control, the kind of military infrastructure, all of that, those are clearly legitimate military goals. And why are they being contemplated in terms of a response to Ukrainian strikes? I mean, if such strikes make military sense, then they should already be undertaken, and not be undertaken in response to a possible Ukrainian attack, which itself would be, I think, an attack on a legitimate military target. As I said, I don't see that there's anything inherently wrong in Ukraine using its drones to hit the victory parade on May the 9th. But anyway, the Zelensky made clear that Ukraine may, he didn't say will, but may attack on May the 9th. And then Russia issues this warning. So let's first of all take a look at what Russia said. So here will be here was initially what Peskov. This was his announcement. And he said, Peskov explained why the May 9th parade will be held without equipment this year. It's about the operational situation. Naturally, we, and in fact, the president spoke about this yesterday in the context of the elections. The Kiev regime, which is losing territory every day, losing ground on the battlefield, has now launched a full-scale terrorist attack. And so against the backdrop of this terrorist threat, of course, all measures are being taken to minimize the danger. The parade will take place, but let's not forget that last year was an anniversary parade. a large-scale one, the kind that should take place on a significant date. This date is not an anniversary, but the parade will still take place, yes, albeit in a truncated format. And clearly, there aren't that many foreign dignitaries who will be attending. There'll be some Serbs there, but from what I could gather, the Serbs who will be in attendance are from the Republika Srpska. So I think the former president of the Republika Srpska, Milorad Dodik, will be there. I think the person who's the current president of the Republika Srpska, I think is going to be there. It didn't look to me that Vucic, the president of Serbia, will be there. So, and then Robert Fico, I think, will be obviously the only European, or at least the only NATO, EU political chief who will be there. But he's going to be in Moscow, but it's not clear whether he will attend the actual victory parade. But nonetheless, Fico said, "Well, we owe a gratitude to the to the Red Army. We're not going to forget it here in Slovakia. Well, obviously it was then Czechoslovakia. So I'm going to be there to pay to offer my thanks to the Red Army." But nonetheless, it's obviously going to be substantially scaled back, and you know, as I say, it could be attacked by Ukraine. Now, this then was the response from the Russian Defense Ministry to the news, because because Zelensky, who was in Armenia, had said, well, I think we could well attack on May the 9th. And we're going to talk about Armenia in a moment. So Zelensky had said that, and then this was then the response from the Russian Defense Ministry. In accordance with the decision of Supreme Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, a ceasefire is declared on 8th and 9th of May 2026 in honor of the celebration of victory of the Soviet people in the Great Patriotic War. We expect the Ukrainian side to follow the example. At the same time, we have taken note of the statement made by the head of the Kiev regime in Yerevan at the European Political Community Summit, which contains threats to strike Moscow on the 9th of May. The armed forces of the Russian Federation will take all necessary measures to ensure the security of the festive events. Should the Kiev regime attempt to carry out its criminal plans aimed at disrupting the celebration of the 81st anniversary of the victory of the Great Patriotic War, the armed forces of the Russian Federation will launch a retaliatory massive missile strike on the center of Kiev. Despite the capabilities at its disposal, Russia has previously refrained from such actions for humanitarian reasons. We warn the civilian populations of Kiev and the staff of foreign diplomatic missions to leave the city in a timely manner. So that's so you know, here there's crucial two sentences. Despite the capabilities at its disposal, Russia has previously refrained from such actions for humanitarian reasons. We warn the civilian population of Kiev and the staff of foreign diplomatic missions to leave the city in a timely manner. So now, from what I've seen in the media story, that these the foreign embassies are not evacuating Kiev, and the question obviously arises, and as I said before, well, why hasn't Russia already done this? I mean, if you have the capability, and this is obviously, you're going to be hitting military targets, you're not going to be hitting civilian targets, then why haven't you done this? Why are you doing it only in retaliation? And particularly, to say that it's for humanitarian reasons, it's hard to see what kind of humanitarianism is involved, given the hundreds of thousands on both sides, Russians and Ukrainians, who have already been killed in this war. So it's a bit bloody late to start talking about humanitarianism. But in any case, we're obviously the question then is well, whether Zelensky is going to do so. And this article from the New York Times makes clear that and correctly, I think this Times makes it correctly point that by the fact that Russia makes this plea that it's going to hold this parade, this victory parade. Victory. This isn't just a religious parade. It's a victory parade, victory over Nazism. And the Russians keep talking about Nazism, victory over Hitlerism, fascism, everything. We this victory. You're going to hold by making a plea to Ukraine. Oh, please don't hit us while we're holding this celebration of our military prowess, of our ability to defeat Nazi Germany. Please don't hit us then. By doing this, Russia is makes itself look weak, and by doing so, Russia is obviously tempting Ukraine to attack. I mean, why anybody would attack? I mean, if your adversary is pleading with you, or don't hit us, and not don't hit us on a day of religious commemoration, but hit us on a day when we're celebrating our military prowess. Don't hit us on that day. You kind of you make yourself look weak, and weakness invites attack. And so here then. This is the Times, who says Russia ramps up threats toward Ukraine over Victory Day parade. Kremlin officials said a large strike on Kiev would be inevitable if Ukraine disrupted the May the 9th event. A prospect President Volodymyr Zelensky has appeared to allude to. And then Russia and Ukraine are trading threats and attacks ahead of Moscow's May the 9th Victory Day celebrations, seeding further anxiety about potential weekend violence in both capitals. Moscow has already announced that it would scale back the parade, acknowledging that it was concerned about long-range Ukrainian strikes. The Russian Foreign Ministry has urged foreign diplomats to leave Ukraine's capital, warning late Wednesday that a retaliatory strike would be inevitable if Kiev were to disrupt the parade, a prospect that President Zelensky has appeared to allude to in a series of statements. And then on Thursday, the ministry reiterated that advice and said that embassies should take with utmost seriousness its recommendations to leave Kiev in a timely manner. And then this goes on. The deep strike campaign has intensified in recent weeks and is seen as the driver behind Russia's decision that the Victory Day parade in Moscow, long an annual display of power and pageantry, will be held without heavy military equipment. President Putin announced a ceasefire time to the celebrations that was widely viewed as an acknowledgement that Ukrainian drones posed a threat. And of course, that's true, because the Ukrainian drones do indeed pose a threat. Mr. Zelensky has seized on that announcement as a sign of weakness, and that's correct. But that Times is absolutely right here. Mr. Zelensky has seized on that announcement as a sign of weakness, largely dismissing the proposal and saying his government wants to secure a lasting peace and not just to protect a parade glorifying Russia's military. He countered with a ceasefire proposal of his own, which the Kremlin ignored. That was we'll have it on the 6th and the 7th, which obviously they knew. Zelensky knew perfectly well Russia would reject that, because there's nothing special about May the 6th and May the 7th. May the 9th was obviously the important day, and of course May the 8th, because Ukraine now, as part of its so-called Western orientation, also celebrates Victory Day on May the 8th, along with Europe. So Russia alone celebrates it on May the 9th, but the Russians said, okay, well, let's do it on May the 8th and May the 9th, but the May the 6th and May the 7th obviously makes no sense. But it is correct that Zelensky, sensing weakness, dismissed the proposal and said that he's not going to. Why should he respect a parade glorifying Russia's military? And then, here, this is Mr. Zelensky, they're quoting him: Russia has not halted any form of military activity. And then saying that Ukraine would act in kind. He mused that Russia has fought to the point where even its main parade now depends on us. Okay, well, that's probably true. And then, so that's now the thing here is that once this war has gone on for such a long time, then clearly Russia is showing its vulnerability. I mean, we've talked about it many, many times before, that the longer this war goes on, the more the scale begins to shift in the direction of NATO. NATO, when you put it all together, NATO is much bigger than Russia. NATO has huge industrial and economic potential, and the various hopes that Russia has harbored over the years that somehow Europe and the United States are going to separate, and they're going to disagree, and they're going to go their own way, and they'll be, they'll abandon the Ukraine project, and they'll get into an almighty fight among themselves, and will fail to present a united front against Russia. I think it's hopelessly wrong. It's hopelessly wrong. NATO will not break apart. What may happen, and I think we can talk about that later, is, and I think it was always going to happen, that there will be a separation of tasks, which is what the Americans have been pushing for many, many years, which is the Europeans should focus on Russia, should deal with Russia. It's up to them to deal with Russia. They're the one, they're in Europe. Is part of the European continent. They should focus on that, while the United States would focus on China. And I think, and so all of this kind of Punch and Judy show that we've been having, certainly since Trump first came to office, the Europeans and the Americans, they don't see eye to eye. They have these sharp disagreements. It's all really basically what the Americans want. The Americans want the Europeans to take over the lion's share of military mobilization in Europe, and the Americans will focus on China, and of course on its own hemisphere. But there's not going to be a parting of the ways between Europe and the United States. NATO is not going to break up. So that's why, for Russia, the problem was always that you had to win that war in Ukraine quickly, because the longer it went on, the more the balance of resources, the balance of economic resources would tilt against Russia. It's just the numbers. Europe and the United States have the numbers, and now Russia has caught a break because of this war against Iran. It's caught a break because now the United States is bogged down in Iran. At the moment, there doesn't seem to be any immediate way in which the United States can get out, but the United States may well get out, because I think the United States is smart enough to know that great powers can walk away from foolish wars without losing any real power or prestige. You could just walk away. Okay, we misjudged this, but we're still a great power. I mean, America walked away from Vietnam. I mean, America could have obviously pulverized Vietnam, 1,000 times over. It could have destroyed Vietnam, obliterated Vietnam. It didn't do so. It walked away, and nobody thought that, well, now the United States has ceased to be a great power. The United States still remained a great power, even after it walked away from Vietnam. How you become a great power is somebody says here Russia could have mobilized 5 million men and occupied all of Ukraine 4 years ago if they wanted to. Yeah, that's what you do. That's how you win a war. You get it done quickly. You use your strength in the most effective way possible, which is you use it right away. Boom, you overwhelm your opponent, and then you've got your and then the war's over. When wars drag on, then they become very tricky. As Germany found both times in both world wars, and one has to say that Germany's leaders in both world wars understood this very point, that Germany can only win a war if it wins it very quickly. If Germany fails to win very quickly, in other words, in the first few months, then the balance of power, the balance of resources is going to tilt against Germany, and that Germany will eventually lose. I mean, the German General Staff knew in December 1914 that they'd lost the war, even though they were occupying France, even though they were occupying much of Russia. The German General Staff already knew they'd lost the war because they knew ultimately the resources, the war would tilt against them. So, but what ultimately determines whether you stay a great power is if you avoid a war, a lengthy, protracted war, and above all, a lengthy, protracted war against another great power. Great powers remain great powers as long as they avoid fighting wars against great powers. That's the key. That's always been the formula. You avoid fighting against another great power. That's how you remain a great power. If you fight against another great power, then it's going to be a huge drain on resources. And if it ends in a defeat, then that has all sorts of serious repercussions. And that's why I think the United States has the ability. Doesn't mean that they're going to do it, but it has the capability of realizing that this Iran excursion, as Trump put it, this excursion is an absolute disaster. It won't deliver anything good for the United States, and the United States can walk away, and no one is the worse for it. The United States will secure a certain objectives, not very much. Iran will survive. It will also secure some objectives, but ultimately it won't challenge the United States' role and power in the world. If you drag the war, if the war drags on into another year, into a second or third year, then your power does come under threat. So what I'm saying here is that that in this war, that Russia is having real difficulties. That ultimately, if you can't win this war right away, then it becomes a real drain on your resources. It becomes debilitating. And if it continues to be inconclusive, then there might be all manner of political crises that could develop, very serious ones for Russia. We already know what happened in the past when Russia lost wars. The defeat against Japan in 1905 led to the 1905 revolution. The defeat in World War I, of course, led to the Bolshevik Revolution. So for Russia, it has these military defeats can have very serious implications. And as things stand, that doesn't look to me that there's any immediate resolution of this war to this war. There's an immediate end to this war, that Russia will succeed defeating Ukraine anytime in the near future. And this is where it gets particularly serious, and this is a topic that I'm going to get onto later. NATO is getting stronger. And it's not just simply that NATO has acquired these two new members, Sweden and Finland, the NATO states are getting stronger. They are spending more and more money on their military. Now you can keep dismissing it. Oh, they're useless and whatever. But, should never underestimate people. I would never underestimate the Germans. I think that once if they put their mind to something, um, they might accomplish certain things. And this, I think, brings us to another topic, which I wanted to talk about, and that is, in fact, the subject of Germany, and in particular, Germany has now introduced something called the new defense concept. Now, remember, we had the Chancellor Scholz, which was the Zeitenwende. He introduced the Zeitenwende in 2022. Germany would become a major military power. Nothing very much happened there, but gradually Germany has been increasing its defense expenditures, and now under the Christian Democrat Friedrich Merz and his German Social Democrat defense minister Boris Pistorius, they seem to be quite determined on becoming a sort of a serious European military power. And so they've now introduced this, what they call the new defense concept. Now, whenever the Germans start talking in this way, I mean, obviously, all states should kind of prick up their ears and listen. It's never a good thing when suddenly Germany becomes militarized. I mean, we've already seen fundamentally the authoritarianism that's always been a part of the German political psyche. You see that authoritarianism is coming to the fore. Arresting people for Facebook posts. We saw Chancellor Merz declaring the other day that he wants to see who was posting what on the internet. He doesn't like any anonymity on the internet. In other words, he intends to send the police after people who say mean things about him. So this is really, after all the superficial talk that Germany is different, they've now become kind of libertarian. They don't like authority. They don't, this isn't the old Germany. This is much more of a kind of the cool, hip, new Germany, much more like the sort of the Anglo-Saxon countries where challenge to authority is much encouraged. Nah, there isn't any of that. But anyway, so we had Pistorius announcing the other day this new defense concept. And here's the story in Deutsche Welle. It says, Germany unveils first ever military strategy for Bundeswehr. For the first time in its history, the Bundeswehr has adopted a military strategy to prepare Germany for future threats. Large sections of the documents are classified. Well, that's not very inspiring. So they announce this new military strategy, and then they say, well, large sections of the document are classified. And then we have the German Bundeswehr has, for the first time, officially adopted a military strategy, citing an increasingly dangerous international situation. The strategy defines the future focus of the German armed forces and analyzes how the Bundeswehr can counter potential threats. Rarely has a military strategy been as necessary as it is in this historic period. Defense Minister Boris Pistorius said during the presentation of the new strategy in Berlin, the world has become more unpredictable and also more dangerous. The Social Democratic politician said, ever since Russia launched its war against Ukraine, and the international legal order has come under tremendous pressure. And then, according to the military strategy, Russia represents the greatest and most immediate threat for the foreseeable future to Germany and transatlantic security. So that's already quite novel that Germany announces that Russia is the greatest and most immediate threat for the foreseeable future to Germany and transatlantic security. Quote, Russia is laying the groundwork for a military attack on NATO member states. Now, there's no evidence for that. But it is quite striking that Germany, in announcing its plan for militarization, for a massive expansion of its military, declares that Russia is the greatest, most immediate threat for the foreseeable future, and that Russia poses a direct threat to NATO member states, that it's going to attack the NATO member states. Well, when you say that somebody is going to attack NATO member states, then what's the remedy? Well, the remedy is obviously you need to take preemptive action. And that, of course, is when you read these statements and when you look at these plans, they're all really a preparation for taking preemptive action against Russia. Russia's a direct military threat. So this isn't, there's no concept here of defense in depth. We're going to defend our borders from a Russian attack. That's not what it's saying here, which is what used to be the case in the Cold War NATO era. There were never any actual plans for attacks on Soviet territory or attacks on Warsaw Pact territory. It was all about, well, we have defense in depth. Either well, that was one strategy, defense in depth, or forward defense. But it was always defense. That force deployments were in anticipation of a Soviet attack, and that there would be either NATO forces would be at the border, or there would be defense in depth, whereby a certain amount of territory would be lost initially to the Soviet forces, but then eventually the Americans would counterattack and drive the Soviet forces out. But it was nonetheless clearly a defensive strategy. This is not a defensive strategy. So despite all the talk, we're very, very afraid that Russia will attack a NATO member state. Why would you be afraid of that? Russia isn't anywhere near to finishing off Ukraine. Why would he want to attack a NATO member state and thereby provoke a war with NATO? Well, the answer is, of course, it wouldn't. But what this is the clear implication here is that Russia is going to be bogged down in Ukraine for another few years, by which time it will be sufficiently weakened. And that's the moment, I think, that NATO is planning on this war with Russia, when Russia will be weakened. I mean, it's already 4 years. 2-3 more years, and Russia will have been at war for 7 years. Okay, so you say, well, Russia's now much weakened. That's the moment to strike, and strike is exactly what this German strategic concept is really about. So, so it says here that the document then goes on to analyze how the Bundeswehr should respond to potential war scenarios, such as a Russian attack on NATO territory, though the details are classified. That's very interesting. Why are the details classified? It goes without saying that we cannot make these scenarios public. Otherwise, we might as well add Vladimir Putin to our mailing list. Well, that's very funny. That's very cute. But it's interesting. You're laying out your new strategy, and then you say much of this document remains classified. And then it says the military strategy reaffirms the previously stated goal of significantly expanding the Bundeswehr to have a total of 460,000 soldiers ready by the mid 2030s, 200,000 of whom would be in the reserves. The stated goal is to develop the Bundeswehr into Europe's strongest conventional army with the fastest possible growth by 2029 to increase defense readiness. So 2029, as I say, at that moment, Russia will have been at war for 7 years. Who knows how many casualties it will have sustained by then. It would certainly be much weakened. That's the time to get involved. These developments follow NATO's increased demands on its members regarding alliance defense. Recruiting sufficient personnel is the greatest challenge, Pistorius acknowledged at a Bundeswehr conference in November. And then here's at Euronews, and here's the gushing headline: Speed and Deterrence, Germany's defense minister unveils first ever military strategy. And German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius unveiled for the first time a military strategy for the Bundeswehr and Germany as a whole. On Wednesday, our goal is clear. We will continue to strengthen the Bundeswehr's operational readiness, and we will do so at pace. Another key pillar of the strategy is the so-called deep strike. Here you see it, deep strike. This isn't defense. There's nothing defensive about a deep strike. The ability to hit targets far behind the front line. Pistorius and Inspector General Carsten Breuer made clear that such capabilities will become increasingly important. This includes long-range precision weapons designed to take out enemy supply routes, command centers, and critical infrastructure at an early stage. So at an early stage, Germany is planning on major strikes inside Russia. So long-range precision weapons designed to take out enemy supply routes, command centers, and critical infrastructure at an early stage. We intend to, at an early stage, in fact, a preemptive attack inside Russia. Against the backdrop of the war in Ukraine, this approach is seen as crucial to weakening enemy structures early and easing pressure on one's own forces. At present, the Bundeswehr has only limited capability in this area. Its main system is the Taurus cruise missile, a German-Swedish weapon with a range of more than 500 kilometers, placing it at the lower end of the deep strike spectrum. And then in future, however, Germany aims to significantly expand its ability to strike such targets with precision and at greater distances. And then it talks about the new cruise missile with the new F-35 fighter jet. With a range of 1,000 kilometers, it would extend the Bundeswehr's reach well beyond current systems. Both the aircraft and the missile are produced by U.S. defense giant Lockheed Martin. And then parts of the strategy are deliberately being kept on the wraps, according to Pistorius. And then as it goes on. And then alongside the strategic overhaul, the German government is planning a significant expansion of the Bundeswehr. The aim is the 460,000 personnel, combining active troops and reserve. Germany currently has around 184,300 active soldiers and roughly 860,000 reservists. And then it says the increase is to be carried out in several phases. The immediate goal is to boost operational readiness rapidly by 2029. In the years that follow, new capabilities are to be added. All right, and then here's defense news. Germany unveils a strategy for becoming Europe's strongest military by 2039. Of course, it's very interesting why they choose as this date 2039, the centenary of the start of World War II. Well, that's very interesting. Why'd you pick that date of all dates for this German for becoming the strongest military in Europe? But anyways, it says title Verantwortung für Europa, responsibility for Europe. The military strategy identifies Russia as the primary threat and sets out scenarios for potential attacks on NATO territory. Pistorius declined to detail the classified threat assessment, quipping that, again, about the mail distribution list. But that's very interesting. Well, what about the German public? I mean, shouldn't the German public know a little bit about these major, serious decisions that the German government is making about their future? And then it says the strategy also marks a doctrinal shift toward a one theater approach, treating NATO territory and the Middle East and the Indo-Pacific as interconnected security spaces rather than discrete theaters. That's very important. As I say, it's all this, one shouldn't be taken in by this kind of Punch and Judy show between Trump and Merz, Trump and Denmark, and even Merz and Macron. It's all about a division of responsibilities. Germany and France are being tasked to take over the running of the continent of Europe, and the United States is going to focus on Asia. And so all of these fights are really about settling once and for all who's going to take responsibility for what. America absolutely wants Europe to spend a hell of a lot more on its military and to be more proactive and more involved in the security of Europe. Then Americans don't want to do that, and that's exactly what when the Europeans say, "Well, we have to think about a world without the United States." No, it's not the world without the United States. Yeah, you're doing exactly what the United States wants, which is spending a hell of a lot more than you were before and getting yourself involved, mobilizing against Russia. The United States doesn't want to do that because it's got other fish to fry. And this thing about this one theater approach is as an acknowledgement of that. And here's Euroactiv. Pistorius unveils strategy to form strongest conventional military in Europe. And the German Defense Ministry submitted to lawmakers a sweeping defense framework, along with a personnel expansion plan, a new reserve strategy, and measures to cut red tape as part of an overhaul aimed at building the strongest conventional military in Europe. And then Pistorius told the Bundestag that peace, freedom, and prosperity and tolerance can no longer be taken for granted and must be actively defended. He said the government's new strategic foundational document set out the agenda of modernization and deregulation designed to strengthen the armed forces. And then again, here's talking about the strategy aims to address how the threat may evolve in the coming years and what a potential wartime scenario might look like, one to which Germany would have to respond in the event of an attack on NATO territory. And then the near-term aim of the strategy is to rapidly ramp up operational readiness by 2029. The longer-term goal is to build capabilities across all domains, culminating in a technologically superior, highly innovative armed forces by 2039. So 2039, in other words, the centenary of the outbreak of World War II. So that's the Germany. But it goes back to my point is that this war in Ukraine should have been dealt with much earlier. Russia, I think, as I've said before, Russia, I think, had absolutely very legitimate reasons to fear NATO expansion to its borders, being surrounded by hostile NATO states on its borders, and ultimately a possible invasion by NATO sometime in the future. So that it had every reason to try to create Ukraine as a buffer state. That having been said, it needed to be done quickly because, as I say, the balance of forces was going to tilt against Russia. So now you've got Germany making this major rearmament. Now, how will other states respond to that? Other states are going to start rearming themselves. They're not going to just sit back and and allow Germany to become that much stronger militarily than they are. I mean, it was a nice time during the Cold War when Germany, although it did have a substantial number of people in the armed forces, Germany was kept subordinate to the United States. But now the United States is essentially delegating to Germany the running of security in Europe while they focus on China. Now they're going to say, well, hey, we've got to deal with Germany on our own once again. And so other European states will also begin to develop their armed forces. It won't be directed at Germany. They're not going to say it, but it'll be in response to this major buildup of German military. But the way they're going to present it as, hey, we're afraid of Russia. So as I said, suddenly NATO is much bigger and much stronger than it was in 2022. And in the meantime, this war still has not been concluded. All right, so that's with Germany and NATO, and then as I said, I did want to talk a little bit about Armenia. So we talked about this the other day, and we had the meeting of the European political community, that it took place in Yerevan, and then we talked about Macron, who was beside himself with excitement, and he was gushing and pouring Armenia's Prime Minister Pashinyan, and then after the meeting, the European Political Community meeting, we had the EU Armenia summit. Now, as I explained on Tuesday, Armenia, it will have an election in June. Pashinyan isn't terribly popular, but pretty much everyone thinks that he was going to win this election, if for no other reason than the European Union will make sure that he wins. I mean, this is a project, and the European Union has made it a project to secure Pashinyan's victory, just as they made sure that Maya Sandu in Moldova won, even though neither Moldova nor Armenia is a member of the EU, but they wanted them there. So, and in both cases, they are leaders who have been disastrous for their countries. I mean, basically, Pashinyan has presided over a complete debacle through the humiliation of two major military defeats at the hands of Azerbaijan, a failure in securing support from Russia and securing support from the Collective Security Treaty Organization. And but as far as the EU and as far as the United States is concerned, he's doing a great job. Same with Maya Sandu. She's been a total disaster. Moldova, easily the poorest country in Europe, total disaster, but the EU wants to keep her there. But anyway, it was clear from everything that Macron said and everything the EU said that they are absolutely, resolutely behind Pashinyan, and they will do whatever is necessary to ensure Pashinyan wins the election in June. So, first of all, let's take a look at the summit declaration, the EU Armenia summit declaration that they came out with, and you can see all the familiar EU boilerplate. We acknowledged Armenia's commitment to build a deep and sustainable democracy as set out in the blah blah partnership agreement and so on. And then Armenia and the EU are bound by shared political values and their commitment to international law, the UN Charter, and the rules based international order. So here's the buzzword. Notice the buzzwords. Political values. What the hell is a political value? It doesn't mean anything. We know perfectly well that the EU has no political values. It doesn't believe in democracy. It crushes and or suppresses elections when it fears that the vote is going to go the wrong way. It stamps out any dissenting voices. It imposes sanctions against dissenting voices. It bans media, and it supports prosecution of dissenting voices. And now, as its next order of business, it wants to stamp out social media companies that don't allow the EU to control their content. So those are the political values of the EU. They have no commitment to international law, and we know that from their various interventions in contravention of international law. We can go back to Yugoslavia. We can go back to Libya. Generally, have been supportive of the United States. Generally supportive even of Israel and Gaza. So they've never really taken to heart international law. And the rules-based international order is that wonderful buzzword. No one knows what the hell it is because we want to know what are the rules. What are those rules and who exactly set those rules? Anyway, we reiterate the core principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity, for neither of which does the EU believe in, as of course we saw in Yugoslavia, as of course we saw in Kosovo. So again, if territorial integrity goes against your interest, you're against territorial integrity. If it goes in favor of your interest, then you're in favor of territorial integrity. The EU just oozes dishonesty. The deepening of our bilateral relations is an investment in peace, stability, prosperity, and blah, blah, in South Caucasus. And then it says, on Ukraine, the two sides express concern over the ongoing war, which continues to cause immense human suffering and carries global consequences. We support all effort towards achievement of a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine based on the principles of the UN Charter and of international law. And then we have the statement by the EU. The EU reiterated its principal position on Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine and reaffirmed its support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its international recognized borders. Now, the phrasing is such that this is the position of the EU, not quite the position of Armenia, but it doesn't say we all agree to that. So it doesn't say, it says that's the EU's position. But nonetheless, the Pashinyan said today that when it comes to Ukraine, we're not allies of Russia. So he's being a very mealy mouth. He hasn't come out explicitly against Russia, but nonetheless, he he kind of went along with the EU very warmly, signed, issued this joint declaration, and of course, most seriously, from the Russian point of view, is that one of the guests in Yerevan was Zelensky, and so Zelensky met Pashinyan, and they had quite a warm meeting, and that, of course, infuriated Russia because, as things stand, Armenia is still a member state of the Collective Security Treaty Organization. Now, its membership is in abeyance, but it is still formally a member. Now, there's a couple of issues that emerge from this meeting in Armenia, which is one of which is the obvious issue of political interference. And even Macron had to address that question because so blatant was the EU interference in the upcoming elections in Armenia that even the French media asked, well, you're kind of getting involved here directly in Armenia, and so this is a story from actually Radio Free Europe. It says here, France's Macron denies meddling in Armenian election. So it says French President Emmanuel Macron denied meddling in Armenia's internal affairs after voicing strong support for Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan, and then during a state visit. And and it says, here they're quoting Macron. He says, you should distinguish between an interference that manipulates information, disrupts the democratic life of a country in a covert way, and openly taking a political position, Macron said, answering a question from a French reporter. So interference that manipulates information. So in other words, I'm just going to set the parameters according to the way I want them. So we have interference that manipulates information. How is France's interference in Armenia not a manipulation of information? You're making all sorts of declarations on behalf of Pashinyan, untrue, of course. That, of course, is manipulation of information. But no, he doesn't want to say that, no. Manipulation of information is, of course, what Russia does. We don't. We believe in information, even as we ban media, left, right, and center, even as we imprison and sanction journalists. We believe in freedom of information. And openly taking a political position. So that isn't apparently interference. Macron said, and so I commit to a full support for a reliable partner of the last 8 years as president of the French Republic, just as I did, for example, with President Maya Sandu. That wasn't interference either. No. That was not interference, what we did for Maya Sandu. When the issue came up, when she faced someone who had a non-European choice. So that's you've cast the issues in that form when she came up with faced someone who had a non-European choice. In other words, anyone who disagreed with Maya Sandu, well, that's a non-European choice. So therefore, we were perfectly entitled to interfere in favor of someone who was making a pro-European choice, even as Maya Sandu imprisoned her political opponents and banned political parties and took them off the ballot with 48 hours to go before the vote. But that's also a part of our political values. And here Macron goes on, I totally commit to defend Europe and also defend the interests of Europe and France by coming here. But this is not the same thing as the interference through information manipulation, media ownership, spread of false information, and destabilization of the rule of law. I say, so I totally commit to defend Europe and to defend the interests of Europe and France by coming here. That isn't interference. But this is not the same thing as the interference through information manipulation, media ownership, spread of false information, destabilization of the rule of law. That's just done by Russia. That's Russia. That's not what we do. We imprison people. We ban the media. But that's in favor of Europe. That's pro-Europe. What Russia does, that's against Europe. That's not that, but that isn't information manipulation. Anyway, and then actually this Radio Free Europe does remind people of what happened in the case of Maya Sandu, which was together with the leaders of Germany and Poland, Macron traveled to Moldova last August to show support for Sandu ahead of the parliamentary elections that were won by her pro-Western party. All the good guys, the pro-Western people. These are like Pashinyan, he's the pro-Western guy. Two Moldovan opposition parties deemed pro-Russian were barred from running in the polls. But that doesn't go against European values. That's fine. Two Moldovan opposition parties deemed pro-Russian were barred from running in the polls. The EU, which sent a special pre-election mission to the former Soviet Republic, defended those bans. Well, of course they defended those bans. I mean, I would have been shocked if they didn't defend those bans, because it's about political values. We have to imprison people for the sake of democracy, because for the sake of values. The EU, which sent a pre-election mission to the former Soviet Republic, defended those bans, alleging Russian interference in the Moldovan election. Well, yeah, Russian interference. Well, that justifies anything. And that's what was going to take place with Pashinyan. And here's the picture, just in case everyone forgot. There's a picture from last year, before the election. There's Maya Sandu, and to her, on the picture, on the left of the picture is Donald Tusk, Prime Minister of Poland, and President Macron, and we have Chancellor Friedrich Merz. So they are the three of them descended upon Moldova in the name of democracy to secure her election victory. That didn't do the job, so they had to ban the political parties that might have defeated her. That's how you do it. You just, so if there's any danger she might lose, well, you got to outlaw the political party. What else are you going to do? Anyway, the bloc is now deploying similar missions in Armenia. Moscow, which strongly denied any interference in Moldova, claims last year that the Europeans are gearing up for a repeat of the Moldovan scenario in Armenia. No. Really? And then this is Russian Foreign Minister spokeswoman, I guess that's Zaharova, says, a mission that will claim to fight against interference in the affairs of a sovereign state is itself an instrument of such interference. And then Armenia's leading opposition groups have also voiced concerns over the EU missions. Hey, but it's about values. Armenia's leading opposition groups, but they're all pro-Russian, so why should we listen to them? They're pro-Russian. Some of them, notably a bloc led by Russian-Armenian billionaire Samvel Karapetyan, fear that they too could be disqualified from the upcoming elections. Well, there's no question they will be disqualified from the upcoming elections. If there's any danger of their winning, they will be disqualified. And Macron will be cheering this on because of political values. Dozens of the bloc's members and supporters have been detained on election-related charges in recent weeks. Election-related charges. Dozens of the bloc's members and supporters have been detained on election-related charges in recent weeks. But that's that's in the name of democracy. You have to do these things for democracy. And then opposition leaders have for years accused the West of turning a blind eye to what they call politically motivated arrests in Armenia for geopolitical considerations. They have also deplored a lack of Western criticism of Pashinyan's year-long efforts to depose Catholicos Gaggle II, which have been accompanied by arrest of several bishops. So that's just par for the course. I mean, the persecution of the church in Ukraine has met no real criticism by the EU. So that, fine. I mean, hey, if they're pro-Russian, they're pro-Russian. They deserve to be behind bars. I mean, that's political values. The crackdown on the Armenian Apostolic Church. Remember, this is one of the oldest Christian communities in the world, the Armenian Christians. The crackdown on the Armenian Apostolic Church was denounced in February by the influential Coordination Council of Armenian Organizations of France. So that's actually Macron's own country. Its two co-chairmen, Ara Toranyan and Murad Papazyan, were excluded by Yerevan from the official inauguration last week of the new building of Armenia's embassy in Paris. So apparently there's money to build a new building for Armenia's embassy in Paris, and they were excluded from the official inauguration, even though they're part of the Coordination Council of Armenian Organizations in France. By contrast, Macron included Toranyan and Papazyan in his delegation visiting Armenia, but it doesn't really matter because they're not going to get any votes anyway. So this is from the news conference today in the Russian Foreign Ministry. So as I say, the Russians are obviously a little unhappy that, they've generally been very unhappy with Pashinyan for some time, but they're obviously very unhappy with Zelensky's presence in Yerevan. Anyway, so here was the question asked Zaharova. So large-scale events under the EU umbrella were held in Yerevan. How would you comment on their significance for Russian-Armenian relations, given that the leaders of countries whose policies are based on confrontation with Russia gathered in the Armenian capital? Well, that's a very good question, because all of the countries who showed up for this European political community, they're all countries whose policies are based on confrontation with Russia. And he says, well, that's very strange. Armenia is supposed to be our ally, but he's hosting all these countries who are hostile to Russia. And then, so anyway, Zaharova replies, after reading the final declaration of the Armenia-EU summit, it becomes clear that the Republic, with the approval of its leadership, is being increasingly drawn toward aggressive Euro-Atlantic standards and mechanisms that are alien to it. This course of action by the Armenian authorities will sooner or later lead to Yerevan's irreversible involvement in Brussels' anti-Russian line, with all the attendant political and economic consequences for the country itself. So remember, this is obviously it's true. This course of action by the Armenian authorities will sooner or later lead to Yerevan's irreversible involvement in Brussels' anti-Russian line, with all the attendant political and economic consequences for the country itself. Remember, Armenia was saved from total annihilation by the Russians. It was by its incorporation within the USSR prevented its complete obliteration by the Turks. The EU, so that's why Russia always feels a little bit sensitive when it comes to these Christians, these Christian communities, because Russia has basically seen itself as the savior of the Christians, particularly the Orthodox Christians, whether it's in Bulgaria or it's Armenia or in the Middle East, in Syria. In other words, these are the ancient Christian communities, Orthodox Christians. They're part of the Byzantine Church, and and when they're persecuted, or they seem to express ingratitude to the Russians, I mean, obviously, it's a little quite sensitive. Anyway, he says the EU's formula is simple: squeeze every last drop out of Armenia to fight Russia, while offering nothing in return except PR stunts. And then and then she goes on, they don't provide any money, technology, or opportunities for cooperation. They don't allow Armenian goods to reach their markets. They only make ridiculous attempts to bring in a group of traveling salesmen who perform simple tricks, lure people with mirrors, arrange jogging parties, and then leave throwing off their masks and smiling at some doorstep. Armenia has received nothing in return in practical material terms. And then, if you listen more closely to what some leaders and officials from Brussels have said, it becomes clear that their primary concern is curtailing cooperation between our countries. And the French President Emmanuel Macron has mused that the Russian military presence should be eliminated. And the Russian military presence is still there, but naturally, of course, Macron wants it gone. Even though, who exactly is going to provide any security at all? I mean, because it's certainly reasonable to question whether Russia has done enough for Armenia, and I think that's a very very reasonable line of criticism. But France isn't going to do anything. Macron, we discussed this on Tuesday. Macron criticized Russia. Oh, Russia did nothing to help Armenia against Azerbaijan. Yeah, that's true. But what did France do? I emphasize that issues related to Russian Armenian cooperation and security, border protection, and economics and culture are exclusively the responsibility of Moscow and Yerevan. What does Macron have to do with this? No one has sought Paris's opinion, nor does anyone intend to. But the most remarkable thing for us about what happened during the European days in Yerevan wasn't Armenia's ostentatious demonstration of its rapprochement with the EU. Russian society remembered with deep indignation and incomprehension the fact that Armenia, which we are accustomed to considering a friendly, fraternal country, served as a platform for the leader of the Nazi regime in Kiev, who was received quite warmly in Yerevan. Zelensky took advantage of this incomprehensible courtesy from his Armenian hosts to attempt to emerge from political oblivion and air his tired Russophobic attacks. But I have my own theory. I believe that Zelensky came to Armenia not because of the EU's false agenda, but because someone, perhaps accidentally, without thinking, decided to demonstrate to Armenia and official Yerevan what EU values truly mean. Here they are. Look. This is Zelensky, who was nurtured in the same way around whom they danced in circles, ran marathons, rode bicycles, who was brought to power, and then he dealt with his country and people. I think it's wonderful that Zelensky visited Yerevan these days. Let the citizens of Armenia see who Brussels symbolizes their successful policy, a bloody neo-Nazi regime that commits terrorist acts against the civilian population of other countries every day. Zelensky, who systematically destroys the Ukrainian people in Ukraine. Without this example, all our words would not be so clear and obvious. It was his visit to Yerevan that showed the citizens of Armenia the future of the EU has in store for them. I applaud him standing up. I don't know who did it. It's not a mistake. It's a true gift. Anyway, I think that's that's understandable that this is the Europe, but I do want to just highlight a very tense exchange that took place between Putin and Pashinyan when he visited Moscow about maybe, I don't know, a couple of months ago, I think that was. But it was quite a tense exchange, and it's just worth taking a look. Let me just find the place. Yep, here we are. Yes, So let's just let's take what happened when Putin met Pashinyan. Um, so here we have first Putin speaking. Dear Nikol Vladimirovich, dear friends, we're happy to see you in Moscow, blah, blah. And then he says, we see that Armenia is discussing developing relations with the European Union, and we are completely relaxed about this. We understand that any country seeks maximum benefits from cooperation with third countries, but this must be clear. It must be stated honestly, upfront, as they say, on the spot. Being in a customs union with the European Union and the Eurasian Economic Union is impossible. So just remember, the Eurasian Economic Union, that's a kind of the economic community that Russia runs. I mean, obviously, it's a kind of very much a poor man's EU, but Armenia is a part of that, and obviously Putin says, well, you can't be in both because we have a free trade area here, and then you want to join that free trade area. Then if you're in both, then essentially the EU gets free access to our market, and that will lead to the EU's wiping out our local industries and our local agriculture. And of course, this was exactly the point that was the issue between Russia and Ukraine in the lead up to the association agreement between the EU and Ukraine, when Russia made clear to Ukraine that you can't have a free trade agreement with us and a free trade agreement with the EU, because then essentially the EU would have a free trade agreement with Russia, and therefore the EU would just simply wipe out Russian industry. So you got to choose which one you're going to go for. You're going to have a free trade agreement with us or a free trade agreement with the EU. Anyway, it says, because some things require significant joint work that must be carried out over years, these include differences in the valuation of individual product or market entry and so on. And then it says, we have completely different, very different phytosanitary requirements, Russia and EU countries and so on. Then it says, there are many problems today, and then someday, perhaps years from now, we, the Eurasian Economic Union and the EU, will be able to resolve them. But even before the Ukrainian crisis, when we tried to reach agreement with the Europeans on working together, nothing came of it. They take a very hard line on practically every issue, even the most minor, as it seemed to me then. And this is where it becomes kind of interesting, because, and here I think Putin is obviously trying to address the salient issue, which is, well, why didn't Russia step in to support Armenia? Now, I think Putin's argument isn't very convincing, because after all, ultimately, the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan was on Russia's backyard, and whatever differences Russia may have had with Pashinyan's obviously a very different kind of character that Russia likes dealing with. This is somebody from the George Soros school, but nonetheless, he was the president of Armenia, and this should have been resolved under Russia's auspices, should not have been resolved unilaterally by Azerbaijan and Turkey at the expense of Armenia. Whatever your views on Pashinyan, but that's what happened. That essentially that Turkey, Azerbaijan, Israel, all moved towards ending this issue over Nagorno-Karabakh, and Russia didn't do anything. So here Putin is trying to address the problem. And he makes a very unconvincing argument, because he somehow wants to say that, well, Armenia had effectively accepted that Nagorno-Karabakh was sovereign Azerbaijani territory, that's one thing to say. That may be right, but it should not have still have not been resolved unilaterally by force. And that's still an issue. So the same way, like let's say China and Taiwan. Yes, Taiwan is regarded as sovereign Chinese territory. That's a different issue from whether China could or should just unilaterally decide from one day to the next to resolve the issue by force. And even there, that there's a stronger argument for China. But in this case, this is in Russia's backyard. This was, they're both former members of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. But anyway, so here is the argument that Putin, he's made this before, and I don't think it's a terribly convincing argument. So it says, now regarding the security issues, of course, the most sensitive issue to date, we understand this, we often discuss this, is everything related to Karabakh. We discuss this repeatedly, constantly, and we know that both you and your colleagues have had and continue to have questions and grievances regarding the CSTO. We have returned to this constantly, but I think it's also clear that after you recognize in Prague in 2022 that Karabakh is a part of Azerbaijan, it would have been completely inappropriate for the CSTO to interfere in a process that had acquired an internal Azerbaijani dimension. As I say, that's neither here nor there, because that's 2022. Russia didn't do anything in 2020. And 2020, incidentally, was still before the start of the war in Ukraine. So that's already 2 years earlier with this statement in Prague, which also doesn't really matter because Armenia had never recognized, had never said Nagorno-Karabakh is a part of Armenia, and had never recognized Nagorno-Karabakh as any kind of an independent state. So it would always accepted that it was a part of Azerbaijan. So there was nothing fundamentally different about this. The issue was the use of force and the ethnic cleansing of Nagorno-Karabakh. That doesn't get Pashinyan off the hook, because Pashinyan should have organized and his country should have made a much more of an effort to prepare for the coming attack from Azerbaijan. Anyway, would have been so. But I think it's also clear that after you recognized in Prague in 2022 that Karabakh is a part of Azerbaijan, it would have been completely inappropriate for the CSTO to interfere in a process that had acquired an internal Azerbaijani dimension. The issue of reuniting Karabakh, if we consider it part of Azerbaijan, I'm not judging whether this is good or bad from the standpoint of organizing peaceful life. I think it probably made sense. As I say, I don't think it's a particularly convincing argument. Anyway, incidentally, thanks for your efforts and those of the president of Azerbaijan, I believe we've now managed to stabilize relations. And then he talks about Trump and that whole, the creation of that transport infrastructure linking Azerbaijan proper with the Azerbaijani exclave of Nakhchivan, which would cut across Armenian territory. And then Putin then goes on, and this is where it becomes interesting, where he's really unhappy about the persecution, political persecution of political figures in Armenia who support Russia. And here it says, and finally, we have a lot of friends in Armenia. A lot, we know that. Many Armenians live in the Russian Federation. Counts vary, but we estimate it's over 2 million, and the Ministry of Internal Affairs statistics actually confirm this. And there are many political forces that are pro-Russian. Of course, I'll tell you completely frankly, we have a dialogue where we always speak honestly and directly. We would very much like all these political parties and politicians to be able to participate in the domestic political work during the elections. Well, you may want it, it's not going to happen. Some, I know, are in prison. Yes, they are, despite holding Russian passports. That's your decision. We don't interfere. but we would like them all to be able at least to participate in this domestic political work. So this is Russia. Then he makes this complaint, and then he said, "Well, we don't interfere." Well, why? Why don't you interfere? Um, and then, because keep in mind, these are, first of all, he says these are Russians who are in prison. Um, one would imagine that much of the Armenian diaspora in Russia will be prevented from taking part in the election, much as the Moldovan diaspora in Russia was prevented from taking part in the election. But it's kind of typical of Putin. He kind of brings this up, a reasonable point. Hey, these are Russians who are in prison, but well, we don't interfere. Well, then why bring it up at all? And incidentally, I mean, we had this. Remember, we talked about this Russians who were imprisoned in Azerbaijan. So Azerbaijan, that's the way Azerbaijan expressed its gratitude for the fact that Russia didn't do anything to stop Azerbaijan from seizing Nagorno-Karabakh. So that, you express your gratitude. Thank you very much, Russia, for not interfering. And so they imprison Russians in Azerbaijan. Anyway, here we have, and then Pashinyan does, regarding the European Union, we know that in principle membership of the two associations is incompatible. But what we're doing and the agenda we have are compatible. That's a fact. As long as there's an opportunity to combine these agendas, we will. And when processes develop to the point where a decision must be made, I'm confident that we will make that decision. And then it talks about Karabakh. Regarding issues related to Karabakh, I've already very transparently and publicly announced that we should not continue the Karabakh movement because peace has already been established between Armenia and Azerbaijan. So that's it. Issue over, I don't care. Armenia and Azerbaijan recognized each other's territorial integrity, political independence, and sovereignty on the basis of the Alma-Ata Declaration of 1991, which means that we mutually recognize that an independent Armenia is 100% identical to Soviet Armenia, and an independent Azerbaijan is 100% identical to Soviet Azerbaijan. That's very nice, except that you've got about 150,000 Armenians who were driven out of Nagorno-Karabakh. And I think this is a fairly solid foundation for the further development of peace. And then, anyway, this is, and then and then he says, we have also, then he talks about the CSTO. We have also never hidden our problems with the CSTO because we had a specific situation in 2022. And in my opinion, the CSTO mechanisms should have worked, but they did not. And this, of course, led to the situation we have in our relation to the CSTO. Basically, it's in abeyance. And then here he starts getting cute with Putin, because when he starts talking about this, the domestic political arrangement, he says, regarding our domestic political processes, Armenia is a democratic country, and we practically always have political processes, and this has become a routine thing for us. And we actually hold municipal elections twice a year. They are also highly politicized because based on the results of our political reforms, people also vote for or against political parties. I mean, not very many, but there are citizens who think that there's too much democracy in Armenia. But this is a matter of principle for us. Our social media, for example, 100% free. There are no restrictions, whatever. And many citizens think this is too much. And in the general context, frankly, we don't have any remote participants in the political processes in our localities. And then he says, I'd like to point out that, for example, we have parliamentary elections coming up, elections for members of parliament. And based on these elections, which de facto will also be the election of prime minister, I'd like to point out that only citizens who hold Armenian passports can participate in these elections. That is, with all due respect, according to the Constitutional Republic of Armenia, people with Russian passports cannot be candidates for either parliament or prime minister, so there are no restrictions here. So he's kind of saying, well, hey, if you're a dual citizen, you're not going to be taking part in this election. It's very, I think it's making clear that it'll be very much like Moldova. Hey, this is going to be a very restrictive ballot. But anyway, that was a very tense exchange. You can find it on YouTube, um, and you can see they compare the tension between Putin and Pashinyan with the hugging and kissing that went on with Macron and Zelensky. Anyway, now let's go to our Gaggle local community board in order to enjoy the comments and thoughts of our locals community, the people who make sure that the dogs are in a happy frame of mind, because the dogs are the ones who really do the work here. They work at it day and night, and often they feel unappreciated, and they make their unhappiness known to me, and so I have to keep them calm and let them know that they are appreciated. And the evidence of that is that we still have our Gaggle locals community, the Gagglers, who contribute so generously to us. So thank you so much, everybody who maintains this community. It's the only way we can keep this this undertaking going. And as I always say, if you want me to address your comments or your questions, there's no point in lurking on YouTube. I can't see all of the comments there. Please join the Gaggle locals community. It's a great community. It's a lot of fun. So many interesting people. So many interesting postings. I'm always fascinated by all the postings that are on our board, and I learn so much from them. So I'm sure everybody will be in the same position as I am in. So please, the gaggle.locals.com. So anyway, so the first question here is from Danaki, one of our best posters. He always posts a number of really fascinating items every day on our board. Was one of our earliest members. So thank you for all your work, Danaki. And Danaki says, "Dear George, happy scaled down May the 9th celebrations without any military hardware and hardly a foreign presence, if you don't count the South Ossetian delegation." Yeah, the South Ossetians are there, the Abkhazians are there, and of course we have the various representatives of the Republika Srpska. So they'll be there. Otherwise, yeah, it's going to be very scaled down. But as Peskov said, well, it doesn't really matter. It's only the 81st anniversary. Last year was a very big deal because it was the 80th anniversary. So 81, because that's not a nice number. It's not a number divisible by 10. So 81 doesn't really mean much. But 81 is not a bad number, because it's not a prime number. It's 3 to the power of 4, so you can do all sorts of things with 81. But nonetheless, it's not as nice as 80. But yeah, that's it. And we talked about it at some length earlier. It's kind of it is certainly sad. It's certainly it has become kind of the holiest days in the Russian, at least secular, calendar, the celebration of victory over Nazism. Even though now, to be honest, it all seems really a long time ago. You got to kind of finish your wars now and not dine out on what happened 80 years ago. I mean, that's just that was then. This is now. You got to win your war now. But it is kind of sad that on such a day, it's quite likely that it will be disturbed by some kind of a Ukrainian attack. So anyway, thank you so much, Danaki. And then Cynthia always very welcome, Cynthia. Cynthia, our film scholar extraordinaire, film expert, film encyclopedist with an amazing knowledge of the history of cinema, an amazing knowledge of the history of cinema production, and all of the manifold um, uh, activities that go into the making of just a single film. Cynthia follows all of that from the editing, the production, the pre-production, post-production, script writing, everything. She's an expert on. So we always benefit so much from Cynthia's voluminous postings about movies, and you can enjoy all of them if you watch our Monday night screenings. So that maybe they screen on Monday night, but they're still on the locals board. You can watch them anytime. Always good films. And as you watch them, please enjoy Cynthia's very insightful, learned, and quite profound comments. And the film currently on on the front page of our board is Gunga Din, made in 1939, Cary Grant, Victor McLachlan, Douglas Fairbanks Jr., Joan Fontaine. A lot of fun. Enjoy the film, and and above all, enjoy Cynthia's comments. The voting continues. We're voting for the runner-up for the films about the British Empire. So the winner was Gunga Din, but now we want to determine the runner-up. Currently, there are two films vying for that runner-up slot. So if you're putting a vote, you could help shape who the runner-up turns out to be. I'm not going to reveal who at the moment which two films are in the runner-up slot, because it has to be a free and fair ballot. So, but if you haven't voted, please do so. Anyway, then Cynthia's question is: I believe Russia's threat to Kiev is no bluff. Yeah. If Ukraine hits the May 9th parade, Moscow must strike back to protect its elites and save face. Yep. Putin, once cautious, is now listening to the hardliners after failed U.S. talks and global pressure. Yeah. To him, Iran's hits on U.S. bases proved escalation is manageable. With Duma polls near, yeah, that's in September, a bluff would wreck the ruling party and spark huge protests. In my view, Russia will hit Kiev's decision hubs because they can't afford to look weak at home or abroad. I think everything you say here is very sensible, and one would hope that something like that would be Russia's response. The problem has been in the past that Putin and the Russian government has made all manner of threats about they were going to do this and they were going to do that. But the fact is that there have been very serious attacks already on Russia, very serious crossing of red lines. I mean, I know they've crossed many, many red lines for Russia, but some very serious ones, like the attack on Russia's strategic air force, and of course the assassination attempts, more than one attempt, on Putin. Almost certainly, Ukraine was involved in all of those activities. Ukraine, with the assistance of the United States. Now, in each of those cases, Russia responded rather weakly. We kept expecting that this was going to be an absolutely ferocious, wild Russian response, that they would, absolutely pulverize and smash Ukraine to pieces in justified rage. But instead, they didn't do it. I mean, what was the response to the attack on the strategic air base? There was no real response. No one could quite figure out. There were some attacks on Ukrainian power plants. There's always seems to be baffling all these attacks on the power plants. I don't know what exactly they're doing. I mean, Kiev still seems to be functioning. Ukraine seems to be functioning. These power plants have not are not out of action. The Ukrainian military is still functioning. They're able to, even with the debilitated power plants, they're able to essentially uh, engage in proper military operations with command and control, the use of the internet, and proper communication. So I don't quite know what Russia has been hitting all this time, but be that as it may, the question is, how will they respond to this attack? Now, obviously, we don't know whether this attack will take place, but if it does, if there's some kind of a drone attack, I will. I mean, it all depends on how serious it is. If it's a very serious attack, like some of the dignitaries will be hurt, or maybe even Putin will be hurt, then I think who knows what happens then. But if it isn't, if it's just a drone attack, then I would suspect that Russia will respond, but it probably won't be a huge, devastating attack on on Ukraine's command and control. And and here, as I asked earlier, why hasn't Russia already taken care of that? I mean, if there are military targets in Ukraine that need to be hit, and that in hitting them, Russia will, strike a serious blow to Ukraine's military operations. If there are such targets, then you ask, well, why haven't they already been hit? I mean, this has been going on for 4 years. Why is Ukraine able to still conduct military operations? Why is Ukraine's command and control, happily off limits to Russian attack? I mean, so I don't understand the logic of attacking them in response to Ukraine's decision to attack Russia on May the 9th. So now, only now, do you make this attack? Well, if they're legitimate military targets, if their destruction will damage seriously Ukraine's military capabilities, then they should have been attacked long ago. Not just yesterday. They should have been probably taken out in 2022. So, I think so even if Russia does take this action, then you'd have to ask, well, why hasn't Russia already done this? Now, I think, Cynthia, you're right in pointing out that there does seem to be increasing disaffection and frustration among the Russian public about this war that seems to be interminable, and there doesn't seem to be any real conclusion, any satisfactory conclusion, anytime in the near future. And I think there are now questions, and the Russians are increasingly asking questions, whether Putin is the right man for the job. Putin had enjoyed a huge reputation, for quite a long time. It seemed like, the best leader Russia had ever had, most successful leader, in Russian history. But I think Russians are clearly wondering whether he's a wartime leader. Stalin was a wartime leader. He was also a peacetime leader, but Putin obviously is not bad when it comes to technical stuff and industrial stuff. That's he is a technocrat. He's comfortable with those kinds of things. Economic production. He's very good at that. You can watch him during those interminable news conferences. His mastery of detail, his ability to understand and explain complex economic questions. He obviously, that's in the area he feels comfortable in. He's not a wartime leader. A wartime leader would have, got his hands around this long ago, and I think Russians are realizing this. So, I think I mean, I agree with you, Cynthia, that Russians will, I think, at some point conclude that things can't go on like this. and I think, if there is an attack, a drone attack, and there is a weak Russian response, another one of these, well, yet, another attack on a power plant somewhere in Ukraine, if that's all that's going to happen, then I think there's going to be more and more grumblings and more of a demand for some new leadership. Now, the problem, of course, with demanding new leadership is like, well, who is this new leadership? Or maybe there's somebody in the background. We don't know. Maybe somebody is already being groomed to take over. After all, nobody really knew who Putin was when Yeltsin appointed him prime minister in 1999. So maybe there is somebody that we just don't know. But I do think that there's some. We're moving towards some kind of a turning point in Russia. I think there's more and more. I think Russians are asking that do we have the right leadership for this to bring this war to a conclusion. Anyway, thank you so much, Cynthia. And then Cynthia goes on. Trump's tariffs and sanctions are backfiring. Rather than scaring rivals, they've sparked a joint pushback from Beijing and Moscow, marked by China's May the 2nd blocking statute, weakening U.S. financial power. Firms like Hengley Petrochemical now openly defy U.S. oil curbs, speeding a shift to CIPS and digital cash. The result, a self-inflicted dual compliance mess and a splintered global trade system slipping from U.S. control. What in his arsenal of terror tactics will backfire next? Well, I mean, I think that I'm generally in favor of tariffs, and I think that Trump's tariffs policy was the correct was I think a good policy, as long as the tariffs are targeted, as long as it's clear what exactly he's trying to achieve. And I think there we go to the familiar infant industries argument, which is what you want to protect certain industries, and you want to make sure that America becomes a leader in vital industries that China had supplanted, in which because China had supplanted in key areas, whether it's rare earths, and all sorts of other things. We saw during COVID how the vital supply chains. China had them, United States didn't. So it was every reason for the United States to use tariffs in order to catch up and overtake China. I think absolutely there's nothing wrong with that. I think that's exactly how industrial policy is supposed to work, which is, hey, we're not doing well here. We're being supplanted by another power. We need to become a leader in this industry, again. I think that's reasonable. Where I think it isn't reasonable, and I think where I think Trump got himself into trouble, is that he started using tariffs in a haphazard way. He started doing it in order to secure political goals. That really isn't the purpose of tariffs. Tariffs are about supporting your industries. It's a part of an industrial policy to making sure that you that you become leader in the areas you want to be a leader of, not in all areas, because that's ridiculous. I mean, you can't be a leader in all areas, and textiles and and sneakers and so on. I mean, you don't have to produce things like that. But when it comes to, important things, important strategic industries, strategic minerals, I think it's perfectly reasonable that you should become a leader there. Autos as well. I think that's fine. But haphazard way when you try to win politically, and I don't care whether China retaliates. Well, let them retaliate. I mean, it's United States can also retaliate against China. So I don't think that's a particular argument against tariffs. Oh, China might retaliate. Okay, let China retaliate. America can always escalate against China or anyone else. So I'm not. I don't care about that. I do care about the use of tariffs for all sorts of, you know, whims. You know, Trump doesn't like what some country's doing, so he slaps tariffs on. I mean, I think that's stupid, and that's completely counterproductive. The sanctions, I'm generally against sanctions. I think sanctions are a really bad idea. Um, they're not really legal. I mean, they're not legal in international law, but you can certainly apply sanctions against anyone that you want. But they are kind of I think, a stupid policy, and unlike tariffs, which are supposedly directed at securing your own interests, sanctions are just a way of being nasty to other countries for whatever reason. And now the America has been imposing sanctions left, right, and center against one country after another. The EU does the same thing, and it doesn't achieve anything very much, because if you're trying to achieve political goals, well, it won't get anywhere. Russia will ignore the sanctions, and Malaysia will ignore them, and Myanmar will ignore them. So it doesn't really get anywhere. And then, yeah, you do get into, as you say, shooting yourself in the foot, which is that, well, if the sudden spike in oil prices, then sanctioning Russia, um, and trying to prevent Russia from selling its oil is going to backfire, because suddenly, hey, we need Russia's oil. You know, we need gas. So that I think is a problem. Yeah, you can't, when you apply these sanctions, you don't know what's down the road. You can't just assume there'll always be an abundance of oil and we can just bash Russia and without any adverse effects for us. Well, if something turns out the world needs Russia's oil, the future of the Persian Gulf is very much questionable. So yeah, sanctions, I think, are a stupid policy. That's why I don't really think tariffs and sanctions are exactly the same. I think tariffs, I think, if applied properly, make sense. Sanctions, I think, are terrible always. But I think Trump has mishandled tariffs by using them as sanctions, essentially, which is not what tariffs are supposed to be. Anyway, thank you so much, Cynthia. Thank you, as always, for your generosity and for all of your great and fantastic comments. And anyway, Robert, always very good to see you. Robert, who's the Gaggles political philosopher, was extremely well read. You know, has read all the political classics, and always raises the tone of the debate here at the Gaggle. So anyway, Robert says Zhirinovsky was widely mocked in 2014, much of it coming from fellow Russians who viewed him as a theatrical ultranationalist, yes, for warning that the Maidan overthrow of Yanukovych would trigger partition, war, NATO confrontation, and a long term Russia West rupture. A decade later, it seems hard to believe that he was ever doubted and calls into question the capacity of an electorate to know its own best interests. Well, I absolutely agree with you. And to be honest, I actually don't think that you needed to have a particular perspicacity to have foreseen all of that as a consequence of the violent, and it was violent, the violent overthrow of Yanukovych. To me, as I was watching the events at Maidan from 2013 to 2014, it was obvious that the consequences were going to be very serious. Yanukovych was really the best that Russia could hope for. He was, maintained a kind of a balance between West and East. He maintained good relations with Russia. He had basically said Ukraine was going to be neutral. It wasn't going to be part of any bloc, but he did want to improve relations with the West while maintaining good relations with Russia. In other words, he was the kind of political leader Russia could dream about. That's exactly the kind of person they wanted in power in Kiev. Basically, maintaining Ukraine as a kind of a bridge between East and West. Which is why, of course, that the West was determined to get him out. They tried to get him out in 2004 with the first Orange Revolution. He won that election. He was robbed of election win. And then when he came back in 2010, his first act was to change the constitution and to go back to the original Ukraine independence declaration, which was that Ukraine would be independent, would be neutral, would not belong to any military bloc, and Ukraine would have no nuclear weapons ever. So that he was exactly the kind of president that Russia needed in Kiev. So the question then arises: why didn't Putin do more to support Yanukovych? And it was obvious to me at the time. I mean, it's not like this is a debate we're having now, 12 years later. I mean, no, I thought at the time, hey, you need this guy there, because if he's overthrown, the people who are going to take over are absolute violent nationalists, Russophobes, and they will indeed launch a war, a proxy war or a real war against Russia. I mean, these people are fanatics. These are Banderites. I mean, the Russians, of all people, knew exactly who they were dealing with. And yet Putin just sat on his hands and allowed Yanukovych to be overthrown. Now, so I think that once he was overthrown, and once the people who now took power in Kiev, these were the people who had been rejected in the election, the 2010 election. The people who had been rejected in 2010 now were in power in Kiev. This is going to end in disaster. And Zhirinovsky went even further than that. He thought that when Russia intervened militarily in the Donbass to save the residents of Donetsk and Lugansk from attack from the Kiev government. I mean, Russia stepped in to protect them. Zhirinovsky said, Russia should just simply march on to Kiev. That this is a horrific regime. The Russians would be welcomed as liberators, and Russia would win pretty easily. That there'd be very little resistance. Russia could just simply, in 2014, march into Kiev. And I think Zhirinovsky was right. I think Russia would have had a legal basis, first of all, for its intervention. Originally, it was a kind of a humanitarian intervention, which was to protect the residents of the Donbass, who were Russian nationals. So to protect them, and then because the coup was illegitimate, obviously because it's an armed coup to overthrow a democratically elected government, then Russia could have justified its actions against Kiev that it was in violation not only of democratic norms, and that this was an armed seizure of power, but it was a violation of Ukrainian constitution and in violation of the pledges that Ukraine had made at the time of its declaration of independence and its whatever it was called, the statement, whatever. I think its declaration of sovereignty, the one that it made in 1990, when the Soviet Union was still in existence, but that was when the important declaration that Ukraine made in 1990, when it said Ukraine will be non-aligned, will not join any military bloc. So that was the time to say we had to take our preemptive action because these people were going to violate the constitution, we're going to violate the declaration of sovereignty, violate the Declaration of Independence, and they'd overthrown a democratically elected government. So Russia could have done all of that, and they would have, I think, enjoyed support, but it didn't happen. But okay, it didn't happen. Zhirinovsky was right. I mean, he said this is what Russia should have done. By 2022, it was much more difficult. Ukraine was now much stronger than it was in 2014, and that opportunity was missed. So I think, Putin, I think, failed twice. I think he failed in not providing enough support for Yanukovych, which was obviously should have done. And then I think he failed a second time by not pressing forward for a much bigger and serious intervention in 2014 when it would have been successful. So I think Zhirinovsky is right. Anyway, thank you so much, Robert. That was absolutely right. Very enjoyable. Oh, and Marty, always good to see you, Marty. And Marty has a picture of Friedrich Merz, Chancellor Merz. He seems to really enjoy wearing these uniforms. Yeah. He's again wearing wearing his helmet and everything. Yeah. And then there he is in his helmet, and what I don't understand is why. I remember when Michael Dukakis in 1988, he got in a tank, and he became a laughing stock. I don't understand why these politicians, these European politicians, aren't also taken to be laughing stocks when they do all this, don all this military gear and the helmets and the goggles and the rifle. I mean, why aren't they deemed laughing stocks? And they are laughing stocks. Merz is an absolute laughing stock, a ridiculous, awful person. Anyway, thank you so much, Marty. And here is Marty's note. He says, as is customary with new chancellors, Mr. Merz had to give up driving when he took office in May. But he is a licensed pilot. Oh, yeah, I was wondering. Okay, he is a licensed pilot. And mid-flight, he told me that he was somehow still allowed to take a plane up some days. This plane, no, he said, it was larger than the ones he was licensed to fly. Oh, that's interesting. So he wasn't really licensed to fly this particular plane, but nonetheless he did so. Well, that's very comforting. And then we have a picture from Marty. It's basically the same picture as I showed earlier. Maya Sandu, Tusk, Macron, Merz, and definitely, absolutely definitely, not interference in an election. Not interference. That is not interference. Interference is what Putin does, not interference. And then, so thank you so much, Marty. And I see Marty also has a picture. I saw this picture. This one with Macron and Starmer, like a couple of giggling schoolgirls, with Macron covering his mouth as he speaks to Keir Starmer. Very, very strange. It's like like I don't know, schoolboys. They put their hand over their mouths, thinking that somehow they won't be seen to be talking. Like when you're talking in class and you put your hand over your mouth, and then teacher won't see me talking because I put my hand over my mouth. But yeah, so thank you for that picture. And Anne Marie, thank you so much for your generosity. Anne Marie, our resident musician, a resident expert on music, and a very distinguished practitioner who performs at the highest international level at the most illustrious orchestras of the world, and who has worked with some of the most eminent musicians, conductors, composers, performers of the 20th and 21st centuries, and really extraordinary people. But I mean, I'm just always actually amazed when she recounts these stories and anecdotes about dealing with some of these renowned international musicians. And we're amazingly fortunate to have Anne Marie as one of the Gagglers, a key part of the Gaggle community, who always makes fascinating postings about the music that we post here. And I always enjoy, and I think all Gagglers enjoy, her reminiscences about performing with renowned musicians and performing in difficult, trying circumstances, and while performing the most difficult pieces of music in the orchestral repertoire. I mean, she works with Wagner. She does the, you know, she performs the the entire ring cycle. That's something. So anyway, thank you, Anne Marie. Really always enjoy all of your comments, and really appreciate your generous contributions. And my time has come to an end. Thank you, everybody who joined me. Thank you so much for all of your comments and questions. And above all, to everyone who contributed to the Gaggle tip jar. And that's where it becomes difficult, because I have to deal with the dogs, and then they ask, well, where's the money? What happened to the money? I said, well, I'm trying to raise money for the Gaggle. Then they're just, they don't think I'm doing very much, or maybe they think I've got my hand in the till, or whatever. But we're going to have to deal with the dogs tomorrow. So we're going to do some more podcasts over the weekend, and then next Monday we're going to do a joint live stream with Peter, and then next Tuesday, 3 p.m. Eastern Time, it will be time for my solo live stream. Look forward to seeing you then. Until then, all the best. Goodbye.